Hello and welcome to this lecture looking at the structure of cells. This will be your first session for your bioscience module, and it will build upon, it will help you build towards further learning about the different structures around organs and body systems throughout the coming weeks. Cells are obviously where we start because they are the smallest structures after chemical elements. And they are varied and very complicated in many senses. However, we're going to try and simplify them for you. You don't need to know everything about cells to be a good nurse, but you do need to have some understanding of the different parts and components that build up from cells to organs. So we want to look at the structure and function of the subcellular components of a cell. So what's lower than a cell cellular level, then we go into the subcellular. We're going to explain the process of cell division, although I'm going to actually give you some links to go off and read about this. So this will only be touched upon quite briefly in the lecture itself. And we're going to look at the types of tissue in the body and give an example where they're found. And this will help you again build up towards organs and body systems. Okay, so this picture just tells us from the very simple starting point of a zygote, which is where we all start, how we develop into more complicated beings. So you can see here at each level, more complication is added, and these are the four types of cells or tissues that we can create. And you'll see at the bottom, we can see things like skin and neuron cells coming from the ectoderm. From the mesoderm, we have cardiac muscle. From the endoderm, the internal layer, we have pancreatic tissues. So you can see organ, thyroid cells. And then from germ cells, we have our sexual cells, which are our sperms and our eggs, depending on which gender we turn out to be. And it's important to start on the note that life is maintained through coordinated activity of cells and tissues. We'll talk later about homeostasis in a session after this session on cells, and you'll see why cells are so important as we go along. And it's important, obviously, to understand that disease processes start at a cellular level. So an understanding of that type of cell can help. Mitochondrial disease would be an example. Obviously, by its name, you can tell where that happens. We'll come on to that in a minute. So people who study cells are called cytologists. And if you were to be working in a lab at the minute, you might be, it's likely you would be looking at a very particular type of cell, and that would be a viral cell. But obviously, when we're talking within the body, we're talking about the effect of anything that comes into the body on the cell. So when you study cells, you're looking at them, you're seeing what kind of cell they are, and what is within that cell. So as we said earlier, the different types of cells, really we split them into two big groups. So we have the sex cells, which are germ cells, and then the somatic, soma meaning body in Latin. So actually that's a lie, Greek, I think. That helps us to understand where we're likely to find these cells. Okay, but what are they? So they are membrane-bound structures, so thin membrane quite often, and they contain a number of specialized organelles. Organelles are small components of the cell that have a particular function. The cytoplasm is the liquid, that is heavy water-based normally, and they each of the organelles within the cell has a function. So you'll see about that as we go through. So some of the key things common to most cells of the human body. So plasma membrane, nucleus, which is the core, and that contains a lot of the genetic material. We also have things like the mitochondria here, and these are very important for creating ATP and power. We have other apparatus in there, which we'll come on to. And then these, the fact that the membrane is semi-permeable and allows things to come in and out, means that these cells are able to affect a change within our bodies. So these are the main components that we will look through. So at the cell, as we said, at the cell membrane, there is different ways of transporting. So certain types of proteins, protein channels, and other chemical channels will allow the exchange of important information. So things like here we've got some glycoproteins, lipids, which are fat, so protein and fat, glycogen, so carbohydrates, all sorts of things moving back and forth, because cells are incredibly energy dependent, and they have to keep a steady state of fuel coming in and excretion of burnt up fuel going out to keep working. You can see there's these phospholipid layer here. They have a head and a tail, and they are actually polar to each other, so they create a head at one end and tail at the other end kind of layer, due to the kind of the way that fats bind and create a polar effect, which is quite interesting. What is the function of the cell membrane? So it separates internal to external environment. It controls what goes in and out. It isn't just random, so there is an active component to that. It communicates, so it might pick up a hormone release or something like that. That means it needs to do something different. An example would be a cell that is responsive to a particular hormone, like insulin or antidiuretic. It has particular markers on it that help to distinguish one person's cell from another, which is really clever. It also, which means it can respond to potentially harmful foreign cells. And with blood typing, obviously that's why we have to be compatible, because the body would recognize it as a harmful foreign cell if it wasn't the right type. It is a bit more complicated than that, because obviously there's going to be, if you split the world, there's going to be people of all blood groups, and we're not all exactly the same in any other respect. So blood is only one component of that. The nucleus, important kind of center of the cell. It contains quite a lot of the important cells, the important components of the cell. So they control the way that the cell works. So you can see on the surface, again, it has its own ins and outs, and a lot of it's almost like the computer. So or the brain, it would direct what the rest of the cell is doing by releasing or accepting in information to make changes. So there's quite a lot of detail to consider when we talk about something called protein synthesis. So our bodies are very lucky that they generally are able to recreate our DNA and RNA. So these are small components of our very genetic being, and but the processes involved essentially allow us to pull apart and rebuild proteins to be used by the body for different rebuilding, for example, for repairing damage, just age-related changes that we have. So cells have a cycle, which we'll talk about in a minute, by which they come into being and then die. And without this process, we wouldn't be able to create new cells. So the body relies entirely on protein synthesis. And it's at this very level where anomalies can happen and cause changes to our body, and therefore sometimes function as well. We're not going to focus on diseases here in this module. You'll do a bit more about that in year 2, but I know this afternoon's session with Rob, who designed the genetic session, you'll learn a bit more about that. This is the kind of close up on the endoplasmic reticulum, which we talked about earlier. And you can see it's kind of a hollow section surrounding the nucleus, again, containing ribosomes, and it takes up quite a large portion of the center of the cell. Yeah, so these ribosomes that we were talking about, so if you look back, you can see them embedded there on the endoplasmic reticulum. This is where protein synthesis happens. The numbers of them vary with cell type. So if you think about it, a cell that doesn't need to rebuild or change or create proteins very often won't need many of these, whereas others will be very rich in them. So actually in your muscle cells, you've got a lot of ribosomes. The Golgi apparatus. So these they're like the kind of royal mail of the cell. They package things up and send it off to the correct part to be used again, and that might also mean outside of the cell, as you can see from this diagram. They form these vesicles, which are just small packages, which can be shot off in fact, they would come up to the cell membrane, and they'd either pass straight through or they would release what they need to release at that point. Sorry, page forward there. So they break off by pinching off. So basically, they pinch at that point, and that closes the cell to create these little vesicle. Yeah. So above this is from an electron micrograph, which is very, 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 very magnified, so that you can see roughly what's going on here, and you can kind of see the little vesicles forming on the end. The mitochondria, these are very important cells. So this is where glucose is converted into chemical energy, but only in the presence of oxygen and water. So this is oxidative phosphorylation, and this is the main driver of energy within a cell. So whenever we think about what we eat and what we take in, and the fact that we have to create glucose and other more complex carbohydrates and other chemicals within our food, without the key components of glucose, oxygen, and water, you can't have energy, which is why we can survive quite a long time on quite a simple diet, providing we have carbohydrate in there. We only really need protein and fat for longer term sustainability, because we burn through those chemicals in shorter supply normally. But glucose is very energy intensive is probably the way to describe it. So there's a lot of energy within glucose, but it burns very quickly. So our body craves it, and we need a good proportion of our diet to be to involve carbohydrates and active glucoses. So what do? Cells do everything. There's no point in kind of making it any more complicated than that. So they utilize water to make energy, food and water, sorry, and oxygen. They make new substances, proteins, sugars, fats, RNA, DNA. They produce specialized substances that might be hormones or other secretions, things like neurotransmitters. They might, which we'll talk about in week 7. They're differentiated depending on the task they need. Some of them move, and most of them grow and divide, which we'll talk about later on. So cell division. I'm going to put a link which you'll be able to click on once you come out of this presentation, to give you a bit of an overview of cell division, and you can listen to someone else for a bit, because I'm sure you'll be getting bored of my voice by that point. So we can look at that later on. The key points, just to note on here, so we have mitosis and meiosis. Mitosis is where somatic cells, so our body cells, the kind of standard body cells that we all have throughout our body, are replaced, and through meiosis we have the creation and division of our cells by of our germ cells and sex cells. So that's what you'll see more of later. And that goes into that. Okay, cell differentiation. So even within a structure, it isn't just made up of one type of cell. This is just an example intestine. So we have these things called stem cells, and these are where the cell hasn't completely specialized, so it's ready to be taken on into whichever part of the system it needs to be changed into. So for example, here you can see at the bottom of the crypt of the intestine there, which is probably where you'll have some goblet cells that release different biles and acids and things like that. There are also some stem cells. So these stem cells will need to decide what they need to become, and they may become an absorption cell. So that in the bowel, obviously, that makes a lot of sense. It might be taking back water or broken down macronutrients. Goblet cell we just talked about. Endocrine cell, which is another specialized cell within the base of the. They often pop up actually on the villus further up there, and then the Paneth cells again. These are secretory cells, so they release other different secretions at that point. So it depends entirely on what is needed. So if a cell dies off, there may be a signal, and that will be through the different signal cells that we talked about a bit earlier to say what is needed next. And stem cells obviously get a lot of newspaper columns from their potential ability to become what we need them to become. However, what we don't have is a good way of making them do what we want to do. So you can take a stem cell, but it might not do what you want it to do, even if you mess about with it in the lab and try and it's a bit like programming a computer. If you haven't got the right code or you don't speak the right language, the computer isn't going to work. And it's the same with stem cells. So this one here, you can see it comes from a hematocyte blast. So you'll learn a bit more about this later on. We talk about terminology. Heme or hem is to do with blood. Cytocell and blast normally means something that is going to grow. So what we can see here is that the cells start to split off and decide what they're going to become. By the time it reaches, say, for example, a macrophage, it's already gone through quite a lot of different changes. So it would need to become a myeloid progenitor cell, a myeloblast, and then a monocyte. And these are the components of blood, especially the what's the word I'm looking for? The immune aspect of blood. So a lot of this is your immune cells. So there are some more here. Just put the question there. Can you see how structure is related to function? I always think a nerve cell kind of is very obvious in terms of what's going on. It's, electrical impulses, starts at one end, goes to the other via the axon there. You'll learn about that later on. Each of these cells will be discussed in each week to a small degree. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about the individual cells, but it will be touched on. And you can kind of see that they might work in a way that that their shape relates to. Erythrocytes have a large surface area. That's where your oxygen blood, your red blood sits, and that's where oxygen is transported around in. So it needs a large surface area to carry and release the oxygen into the rest of your system. Pretty clever. So the study of tissue. So tissue is the combination of cells together to create the next level of structure, which is tissue, and this is called histology. And this is really where a lot of disease happens at this level. So you can kind of start seeing things, and there'll be for example, if somebody has what they is maybe questioned a tumor removed, there'll be a histology report as well as a cytology report, and that's looking at the bigger combination. So are all the cells acting in an odd way together to create tissue that is tumorous or malignant in some way? So we talk about epithelial tissue. This is normally a covering or lining. So epithelium, you'll think about skin and things like that. Connective tissue is protective and supportive. It's normally elastic. It has the kind of properties of a younger person's skin, for example, who if you pull your skin tight and let it go, it will bounce back into place. As you get older, as you can see with my face, that doesn't happen so easily. And then you've got muscle cells, and that can be voluntary or involuntary, so smooth, and there's all sorts of different types of muscle cell, but that's a very specific cell. And then nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is incredibly complicated, and there are so many different cells within our nervous system. In fact, it's about 70% of our brain is made up of non-neuron. So although we think of the neuron as the big cell of the brain, it's actually only a small portion of the cells, the neurons. This is some examples of the epithelium. So we have, you can see here, they're set up in layers really, and they create layers to protect the body, to protect internally different parts of our organs, to allow us to sometimes it might be to secrete something or for something to travel through. And this cuboid here, that could be a vessel of some description, so a lymph vessel or something like that. Connective tissue, these are made up of an extracellular matrix and some cells, and the matrix is proteins in essence. So they're stretchy fibers, very strong. If you think about what that might be, it could be some kind of adipose tissue, so have a bit of fat in there. It could be, they're normally quite elastic. So fluid connective tissues, they might contain, be in the cardiovascular or lymphatic system. And then supporting, we'd have cartilage, and bone actually comes within this. So bone always confuses people. Obviously bone is a solid structure, but it doesn't start as a solid structure. And in fact, as your bones grow, they are releasing small cells that migrate to different parts of the bone to replenish and make them grow. We don't start out at whatever height we are, do we? We grow. So that's really important. Yeah, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this. It's certainly up to you whether you want to look at the different types of connective tissue. The one that's quite interesting to me are these the fibrous connective tissue and cartilage, because people think of tendons and ligaments and cartilage as the same thing, but one is much more movable, which is your cartilage, so it allows for things to move around on it, and the other is very strong and doesn't really allow movement. So if you think of your Achilles tendon, your Achilles tendon is pretty much fixed at the length it is. You can stretch it very slowly over time with lots of flexibility work, but actually it's set as it is. Therefore, if you overstretch, you can rupture it. So it's very strong, though. It takes quite a lot of effort. Your muscle tissues. So you've got skeletal muscle here. Skeletal muscle being the type of muscle that helps us to move around, so our biceps or whatever else. Our GI tract, our gastrointestinal tract, has a huge amount of muscle in it. So that's how we move food around our body, through muscular contraction. You'll do more about that in a few weeks with Alazar, who's talking about that, I believe. And then heart muscle. Heart muscle has to be pretty much resistant to fatigue. So if you imagine you want a muscle that is not overexerting itself, but is constantly going, so it has to be very different to the skeletal muscle, which has to be very normally good at short bursts of energy and periods of rest. So they're all designed differently. Nervous tissue, so we talked a bit about this. You can see here, if you look at how many neurons there actually are in there aren't that many. The rest of that is built up of all sorts of different supporting cells, providing all the different needs of the neurons, and that could be to stop anything from attacking them or causing damage. It could be providing the huge amounts of glucose and oxygen that the brain needs, or the rest of the sensory system, yeah, and there are other cells that just support it and create physical barriers between each neuron to stop them from migrating and moving too far. We move up to the next level, so we've had cells to tissues, then we start looking at systems, and what we're really talking about then is organs. Yeah, so at this point the tissues start to make up organs. We talked a good example about there. So this could be a picture of the brain. And this tissue would have to be organised in a particular way for it to be brain tissue, which would be different to spinal tissue and would be different again to peripheral nerve tissue. So that's where organs start to come together. Okay, so the brain is an example of an organ in the body. And when we add them all together, we start to think of the organ system level. So here we've got an example where it goes what looks like some kind of connected tissue, possibly a blood. Oh, yeah, it's a blood vessel. There we go. And then that moves up into a bigger level, which is the organ system level, which is includes the heart and the rest of the vascular system, all the way up to the brain, all the way down to the feet and at the extremities. So at this point, each system has to interact and relate to other systems. An example here, the heart is very closely linked to the lymphatic system and to the nervous system to provide control, and also to the gastrointestinal system because it has to deliver what is taken in through food to our gets broken down and put into our blood and taken around the body by this vascular system, and also excretion, and also of course our respiratory system, which brings in oxygen and gets rid of carbon dioxide. So you can see how all these things start to build together to our organismal level, which is being a human being. So that's where we're going to leave it today. We'll move on now and look at some terminology and also about homeostasis, how all these systems work together, because that's the crux of the matter. It's all well and good having the structure there, but the physiology of how this all works is also really, really important. Okay, so I'd advise you to now go and have a look at that link that I told you about, which will be about cell division, which shouldn't take you too long to look through, and move on to the next section. So there'll be a few questions on the MCQ at the end of today on the cells, which should help you in preparation towards your exam. Okay, thanks very much for listening.